to another episode of Spart Talk. I'm back with Ray Bishop to talk more about China. Welcome back, Ray.
Yeah, thank you.
So, as part of clarifying our own understanding and perspectives of the changing world situation following Trump and what are the tasks of communists therein, we published in the brand new Spartacist a document on China, which is voted by our international leadership. And we have called it, quote, China, do nothing, lose. So my first question to you, Ray, is what's behind this headline? What's the punchline, I suppose?
Okay. Well, I think it's no mystery to anybody in the world following events that China is the main target for Trump's whole program, whether it be trade wars or all the other pressure he's putting on the world, which is aimed at what? It's aimed at trying to fortify the U.S.'s position atop the world order as a world hegemon when that position is crumbling. So what does Trump want to do in the U.S.? He wants to reindustrialize, both to be the champion of the world market, but really importantly for military purposes, since the U.S. barely builds any ships anymore. Yeah. Whereas South Korea, China, they build the majority of ships sailing the ocean's waters, right? So in so many ways, the U.S. has to do something to build back up. But the real target is China. And we see it very, very clearly, of course, with the trade wars, with the constant, barrage of tariffs and all that kind of stuff. Well, but what's the problem here? Why do we have that headline there? Well, here, the Trump administration is really taking a hammer to the whole globalized economic liberal order. But China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, has said over and over again that economic globalization is irreversible. And in that memorandum that you cited, we quote a foreign ministry spokesman for China who said last month, this is a quote, China remains committed to joining hands, not throwing punches, removing barriers, not erecting walls. Okay, but the U.S. is dismantling those walls. And we want China to throw punches. China should challenge U.S. hegemony. Our concern is not one of, victorious Chinese nationalism, but because, as we wrote in another article that's in the same issue, which is an open letter to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, we wrote that U.S. imperialist aggression against China is not only a dagger pointed at the Chinese people, but a threat to the economic and social conditions of the international proletariat. So this is what's at stake here.
Yeah, I guess, we've already done one episode on China, so listeners might already be aware, but our starting point is that, China is not some capitalist imperialist power, but it is in fact a deformed worker states. The gains of the 1949 revolution that happened in China, they are still very much there. And it's the duty of the international proletariat and all erstwhile socialists to defend those gains, right? So that's our starting point. But in what you just outlined, there's a number of things. And some of my questions that are going to come up, they're based in part, obviously, the criticisms we get from various corners of the political spectrum. We start off by talking about the tariffs reaching at the heights of 100, 140 some percent. And the CPC was really, for all intents and purposes, they were, quote, fighting back, I guess you could say, right? I think both parties have now since climbed off those ladders. But, the quote you said from Wang Yi, that globalization is irreversible, that tells us something about really what the outlook of the CPC is, right? Because I think there's a huge current from certain segments of the socialist left, and they look to China, but not just China, but almost the CPC as this counterweight to imperialism. China is going to lead the fight against the US. And as you said, yes, we want China to throw punches, but that's not quite there seems to be this contradiction where the CPC, one could say, has been pushing back, but we're saying, no, they're not really. Could you explain a little bit the contradiction there?
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up. In different social media and in some letters we've received, we've had comments to that effect from people who say, what you're saying doesn't make any sense. You have a contradiction, ICL. You say you defend the People's Republic of China, but you oppose the country's policies. So this is actually a very important question to answer. And what we know of the rest of the left, they cannot answer that question because most on the left think there's nothing to defend in China anymore. They think that because of the last 30 plus years of phenomenal economic growth, China's become a new imperialist power. It became capitalist sometime from the late 80s to the late 90s, etc. So they reject what's the most important task for the working class the world over today, which is to beat back the imperialist campaign against China. But we have to answer that question because the masses in China instinctively and in their gut, everything else, they know that there's something to defend there. They know who the enemy is. They know who's attacking China. And they know it's not because China is trying to supplant the U.S. It's because the U.S. wants to fatally weaken China and then destroy the whole system that was created after 49. So we have to give a serious answer to that. So you have to look at what needs to be done. This is based on the fact that the Chinese economic growth of the last period, right, was based on the fact that it was able to integrate into the world market. The reason was that the U.S. had emerged very, very triumphant after destroying the Soviet Union, which had prior to that time, 1991, 1992, had been the only real counterweight to the U.S. on the global scene. So it was triumphant. And it said it's the triumph of liberal democracy and of the market. So it didn't feel any threat from China and saw that they could use it as a low-wage platform for manufacturing. And inevitably, they thought China would go the way of Western democracy and get rid of the Communist Party and all that. But that's not what happened. So by the late 2010s, the situation had started to change into something very different, where the U.S. was losing its hegemonic position and China was becoming its main competitor in the world. But what does the CPC want to do in that situation? They want to keep things going the old way because this whole economic model is based on that. So it's not willing to wage a struggle of the masses of the world to try to fight back against American imperialism because it really does not want to unseat the U.S. in that sense. So that speaks to the conservatism of the Chinese leadership. And my last point on that is there's a material reason for that, which is that the upper echelons of the Communist Party get tremendous material benefit from their position atop that worker state. That includes business connections with actual Chinese capitalists, which they're not, but a lot of times their children end up as some of these new capitalists with their connections around the world, all the privileges they get from the corruption in the regime, all of that. So what they are not for is the one thing that could really beat back American imperialism, which is try to form a united fighting front of the workers and the peasants and the oppressed people, starting in Asia, but reaching throughout the world. But that's really the way that these attacks on China have to be fought. And to just try to piece together a world order that's disintegrating is a road to further crisis in China. It's a road to disaster, not to the victory that they say they're preparing. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how we want to approach the people who think that the CPC sort of understands the way to fight this stuff. No, we say they don't.
Yeah. Well, I think it definitely starts to answer our question, but for the sake of, I do want to go deeper into the article and touch the different kind of fronts on which the CPC should be fighting is indeed being attacked, by imperialism. So in this article, we talk about the world conflict, for example, Taiwan, which is a huge, huge question, has been for some time. So why don't we start by actually just laying out concretely, right? Because I think what's already becoming obvious and what listeners will find is that the thread here is really two different conceptions of how to fight imperialism and how to defend China, right? So our main contention here is that, well, the CPC's entire strategy, which, as you just explained, stems from its nature as this conservative caste, is actually undermining the defense of China. And we have this counter proposal to it, and you've already alluded to the open letter to the CPC, which we have gotten a lot of flack for. It's proving to be quite controversial in different circles for different reasons, but, we'll be touching on this throughout. But why don't we start with world conflicts?
Sure. Well, yeah, let's talk about the areas bordering China itself. You mentioned Taiwan. That's extremely important. The U.S. is constantly provocative over Taiwan. Since the Korean War, Taiwan's played the role of being an outpost for American imperialism right off China's coast. And today it also has strategic importance because it's the place where most of the world's advanced semiconductors are made, right? Okay. The CPC's program is what, though? They want to reunify China and Taiwan, which is a just cause. But the way they seek to do it is to maintain capitalism on the island. They've been very, very clear about that under their slogan, one country, two systems. The same blueprint they had for getting Taiwan back from the British back in 97.
You mean Hong Kong?
Hong Kong, sorry.
Yes.
Okay, but look, that program of maintaining capitalism in Taiwan can only alienate the working class in Taiwan. And what's the main problem here? The main problem is Taiwan is totally under the thumb of American imperialism. Okay, so we need to lay out a program, right? And the workers and peasants of China need to be fighting on a program that actually mobilizes the masses in Taiwan to break those chains to American imperialism, right? So what can be done there? Well, what the People's Republic should promise to do is to expropriate the capitalists on the island, put the industries in the hands of the workers, and to extend the democratic rights that they have. This goes totally against the policy of the CPC. So that very necessary program has to be connected with a program for the workers on the mainland to take political power in their own hands. Now let's relate that to the Philippines, which is actually in the front line of the campaign over Taiwan because of its geographical proximity to the south coast. So they're potentially in the front line of a war over Taiwan. Again, the strategy the CPC should follow if it was conducting a real fight, a real revolutionary fight, would be to win the masses there, to fight the U.S. dictating Philippines' role in the world in their anti-communist crusade. Right? That's what we mean by forming a united front of workers and peasants against imperialism. And one other place I would point to, which is right, which we don't talk about in the article, but it's quite relevant, South Korea, which has been in almost a constant political crisis since last year. It's now a major target of the Trump tariffs, which could have a very devastating effect on what's a strongly industrial economy. And this all has to do with the campaign against China. Now, that country, South Korea, has a very powerful industrial working class. So what's key is to break South Korea's alliance with the U.S. It's really key. And that relates to what strategy the PRC should be following, you know?
Yeah, I think as you're laying that out, it's so clear that in each of these three cases, what we're trying, like what a revolutionary strategy would try and do is undercut the appeal that the imperialists have, or the imperialist kind of machinations amongst populations of these countries, to undercut them in order to build revolutionary solidarity between, for example, the Taiwanese and the Chinese and the Filipino masses and the Chinese and so on. But as you said, the CPC has very consciously said we seek to be number two in this globalized world situation, which is never going to be reversed, right? So if you have this as your starting point, then it's obvious that you're not really going to fundamentally tinker with that. Coming to other world conflicts. So, I mean, Ukraine has been going on now for over 2 years. Israel, Palestine. So to those who really look to China as this harbinger of socialist change, China, as far as I'm aware, has not really played a very progressive role in these cases, when actually it has a material, military, and other capacity to do so. Again, I think linking this to the broader question of what should a worker state do to combat imperialism, and what is this particular worker state doing?
Right.
To bring home the point about China doing nothing.
Well, basically, its profile has been to be among the peacemakers of the world, okay? Which leaves the underlying causes of these conflicts unaddressed. And in Palestine, the genocide goes on. Why hasn't China provided material aid to the liberation struggle of the Palestinians?
Very good question. Yeah.
They produce a lot of military stuff. They have economic weight in the world. What has gone to the Palestinians? Nothing. So that's just a very simple point. The communist movement, when it originated after the Communist International Movement after the Russian Revolution, that was one of its principles, its founding principles, the Communist International. Peoples fighting imperialist oppression, or fighting for national independence, or fighting for their own national liberation. In that situation, the role of communists in other countries is to give them material aid for their struggle. It's a very simple point, because building a socialist world means a combined effort of workers from around the world and the oppressed peoples fighting for their liberation as nations. And if that doesn't pertain to Palestine, it doesn't pertain to anybody. There's one other thing I can mention, which I think people have a lot of illusions in, which is all the development projects that China has sponsored in the global south, loosely grouped under the Belt Road Initiative, if you will. Let's speak about that for a minute, because I think that's a more contentious point. Those projects were built mainly by imported Chinese workers, whether that be, the rail lines developing the ports. And even where local workers were employed, unions were suppressed. On top of that, China's economic strategy up to this day and continuing is to keep producing for export. Well, in less advanced countries, the effect can be seen in places like, South Africa and Malaysia as well. If you combine the effect of that massive amount of production of things like steel and other products, combine that with the effects of Trump's tariffs. That means that black steel workers in South Africa are being thrown out of work, and factory workers in Malaysia are being thrown out of their jobs too, right? So take that together. That's not a great way to win the hearts and minds of the working class, okay? So instead, we say that China should coordinate development plans with the workers of those countries, keeping in mind the needs of those workers, their material needs. Local workers should be hired under unionized conditions. They should be paid a living wage. That's a great way to get them to join the fight against imperialism and to side with China. Okay. So that's to start, but I mentioned that because there is this solution that China is sort of building the foundation for an alternative to an imperialist dominated economic, trading system and all that, but it's not true. And that's even true about that the Chinese currency will supplant the dollar at some point.
Yeah, the de-dollarization.
Right. Well, the problem is that China and every other country in the world is still in a trading system that's dependent on the dollar. So even if China conducts bilateral trade with countries that are in the yuan or in some other currency, well, they basically have to exchange that for dollars at some point anyway, right? And the Chinese leadership is not willing to upend that system, where we think that they could lay the basis for an alternative system if they made the yuan a convertible currency based on real value, such as the holding of gold, and stop pegging the yuan to the dollar, which all the BRICS Plus countries do essentially, no matter what they say. So they could establish a convertible currency that could actually lay the basis for an alternative world trading system that would have in mind the interests of the world working class. That would be an alternative to the current financial order dominated by the U.S. But to do that, you'd have to break with the whole CPC program, which is based on not building world socialism, but just, okay, we have socialism in China and that's it.
Socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So, on each question that you push a bit deeper, the fundamental problem is you need to break with the current world system, which is dominated by the U.S. You need to make a fundamental break with the imperialists, right? You need to make a fundamental break with this peaceful coexistence strategy, and all of that gets to the heart of the CPC and what its nature is, right? What you started with. Let me start coming to. I know we've talked about this a little bit already, but the open letter we wrote to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. So to give our listeners a bit of a taste for what we've experienced with this so far. Well, first, I'll just start by saying that, we are partisans, right? We stand on the side of China. So it is in our interest to put forward a perspective to defend China and to advance the Chinese revolution, right? So it was in that spirit that we wrote this letter. But, we have gotten so much hate that, you're basically telling the bureaucracy, the CPC, to reform itself. You're basically giving them advice, and what are you talking about? Well, that can't be revolutionary. So we've talked, I think throughout this conversation, we've been talking about the counterpost strategies and how we really look to the working class and how the CPCs, the way it conducts anything to do with China, how it really ends up pitting workers of the world in opposition to China. The other component of this article this letter has to do with the domestic problem, yes. Right? So there's a subhead in this letter called "The Greatest Danger is Domestic." Because obviously we've spent this whole time now talking about imperialism.
Right.
But there is another problem, and we call it, in fact, the greatest danger. So I'll pose two questions to you. One is, if you can elaborate a little bit more as to why we're talking to the Central Committee. We've been saying how these guys are, conservative, blah blah blah, but we're still writing to them. One, and two, what is this greatest danger, and what do we have to say about it?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Some people think we're off our rocker because we don't support the CPC when China's under attack, and other people say we're off our rocker because now we're capitulating to the Communist Party.
Right.
It's actually not that difficult to explain. Consider this our attempt to start forging a united front against imperialism, right? We are on the side of China, in the struggle against imperialism. Well, so is the CPC for its own interests, but we think they have a terrible strategy to carry that struggle forward. So let's fight together. Everybody who defends China, everybody who wants to fight imperialism, should be fighting together as in a military conflict. But let's talk about the strategy, how to defend China. It's really as simple as that. So you make a very good point. China is the most vulnerable on its own terrain. So here's one extremely big problem. Its integration into the world market did in fact help bring about tremendous economic growth. It simultaneously created enormous social divisions in China and led to the creation of a very large domestic Chinese bourgeoisie. Mm-hmm. Okay? That class, while they don't have power, because the CPC still calls the shots there, that class is a direct threat to the People's Republic and all the social gains that have been made since 1949. Mm-hmm. Also a great danger is the corruption and exploitation that came along with that integration into the market. So most of the left says all these evils mean that China is imperialist, that there's nothing left to defend there. They're dead wrong. And their position makes them completely unable to fight against the real imperialists that are threatening China. So our letter is addressed to the people who stand on the right side of this question. And it's about how to really strengthen the PRC to carry out this struggle. In the first instance, expropriate the Chinese bourgeoisie, bring all of industry under state control, and place that control under the direction of the working class, not money-grubbing bureaucrats. China now has overcapacity in production of everything from solar panels to electric cars. Yet the CPC wants to keep plowing ahead along the same road that's extremely wasteful. You want to strengthen the working class in the fight against imperialism, change the tempo of investment for exports, cut it back, retool the excess capacity for social necessities at home, medical care, education, elderly care, the kind of things that rot out the worker state from inside because those are real needs that people have that are not being met. We think they could drastically reduce consumer prices and give workers a huge pay raise. Workers work enormous amount of overtime just to get by, including in those factories building electric cars. There's massive overtime there. So it's a vicious circle. We also raise in that, besides, that those basic components of a rational sort of economic planned system of production and getting rid of bureaucratic parasites and those really filthy rich Chinese capitalists, we also link it to the struggle that must be waged against the Communist Party's suppression of the national aspirations of China's minorities, which we talked about in our last podcast, you and I, the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and others. All that their suppression of self-determination does is to turn people into anti-communists and into available tools for the imperialists to use in their machinations against China. So revolutionaries would say that granting these people self-determination is the only way to unite them with China's mass Han workers and peasants and build socialist unity against imperialism. So to sum up our open letter, we're making a point to look, these things need to be done, and there's going to have to be struggle among communists in China for these to happen and to toss out the CPC's current policy, its whole construct, and for the workers to take matters into their own hands. But the basic point is the CPC's program and strategy is not winning. We want to stress that. It's not winning today. China and its economy is much more vulnerable to tariffs and other pressure by the imperialists than the imperialists are vulnerable to any pressure China can exert on them. And so that strategy will prove unable to weather the storms that are coming because it's not based on challenging and defeating the imperialists. That's the key thing.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. For my own, the little conversation I've had on this letter in Spartacist, I think somebody asked, well, this is such a capitulation, you don't talk about political revolution anymore, because Trotsky's famous perspective against the Stalinist bureaucracy in the Soviet Union was to fight for a political revolution. Our detractors say, well, this really shows how far you've gone down your capitulatory road because this is not really it. But I think that, again, it's kind of a simple explanation that, as you said at multiple points throughout this episode, Ray, that the workers in China, they feel it in their guts that there is something that for them, it's very clear, like, who is the enemy, right? And we're actually addressing this to them. Yeah, okay, the title says open letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, but like, this is a tool in the hands of the Chinese working class to say to them, okay, well, this is happening. Why don't you think about doing this and take the fight to the CPC? Take the fight inside the branches, inside the party, and fight to split the party, right? To fight against the bureaucracy, essentially. So this is actually, okay, fine. The term political revolution doesn't really show up here anywhere, but I think that this itself is a tool that advances that perspective. Anyways, that's my 2 cents.
Exactly.
On this. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
Exactly.
I think we've kind of summed up, like, what do we have to say about China, Trump's new kind of world order, what we think the CPC is doing wrong, and what we present as an alternative. Is there anything else that you wanted to add on?
I would say that, yeah, a formalist who professes Trotskyism and says that, well, you see, you have to start from there has to be a political revolution and everything else flows from that. We would say, well, that's not going to win Chinese workers to anything. What Chinese workers need to understand is what is wrong with the CPC strategy. Now, look, let's be very clear. China is under attack by the imperialists. There will be a natural inclination for the workers, for the peasants, and pretty much everybody else who understands the situation to rally around the CPC now, right? Because that's the only thing, the only tool they seem to have to fight back against the imperialists. So what Trotskyists need to do, what all communists need to do, is to debate the question of what is the right road to follow to fight back against the imperialists and defeat them. And it's by understanding that the CPC strategy will only lead to failure and defeat that the working class will be provided with, deeper understanding that something else needs to happen in China, that the situation needs to be taken out of the bureaucrats' hands and put into the workers' hands. And every single demand or important political question that we talked about in this podcast points in the same direction. Expropriate the Chinese bourgeoisie, then what? The workers need to take control of the economy, take it out of the hands of corrupt bureaucrats. National rights for the minorities. How can that not benefit the imperialists by breaking up China? Well, it's by forging a fighting alliance with the mass of the Chinese workers and peasants against the imperialists. But that's not how the CPC sees it, right? So I just want to end by saying, look, these questions are of really vital importance for the left in China and externally, but not only the Chinese left, but the whole left around the world, the whole workers' movement to be debating, because there's really no time to lose in organizing a fight back in defense of China against these imperialist attacks.
Absolutely. In the previous issue of Spartacist, we have a long article called Not Capitalist, Not Imperialist, right? Where we lay out the class nature of China and why we have a side with it. Now, weeks ago, I was in Paris with another comrade at this conference where about, 30 organizations were gathered together to discuss, trade union questions and the world situation. I mean, for me, what's a huge problem is that 95% of those organizations in that room take as their starting point that China is imperialist. Like, they see it as such an accomplished fact that this is a closed book. We've drawn our lines. There's a closed book and there's no need to further debate this question. And because, things like, oh, well, look at the amount of capitalist that has, or blah, 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 things like that. But this is not a done deal. This is very much a question that needs to be debated.
Exactly.
Debated urgently, aggressively within the left, because, we've seen the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was a massive setback for the international proletariat. Something like this happens today, that's going to be much more devastating. I just can't stress enough the necessity of just prying open this whole question of the class character of China and really fighting within the left to have a real materialist Marxist understanding of what is the state and how do you understand it. Because I think without that, you will not advance the fight against imperialism today. But yeah,
That's absolutely right.
I think with that, I'm out of questions on China and current world situation. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Ray?
I think we kind of covered it here.
Yeah.
I'd like to get some feedback on this. That would be very interesting.
Definitely. I would just like to alert our listeners to the fact that we have, a fair amount of correspondence on the question of China. Some of that correspondence is published on our website, which I'll link to in the show notes, which takes up some of these questions. Okay, well, how do you claim to defend China when you're going after the CPC leadership, et cetera, national question, and so on. So that correspondence gives you a real sense of what are the living questions in this debate. Right. So I'm just alerting listeners to that.
Just one point on that.
Yeah.
It's also a good antidote to basing your judgments on the Twitter sphere, right? Because we've gotten a lot of hostile comments on the Twitter sphere, but you know what? Who's likely to respond on X? It's exactly the people who just say, well, you guys are nuts. But even there, you get these questions that really have to be answered. And that show that people understand that there's something not quite right with how the Chinese regime is pursuing their struggle. So there has to be a reason that they're reacting strongly to what we're saying.
Yeah, the degree of reactivity, I think, is definitely a sign of that. Okay. Well, I think on that note, yes. Okay. I'll link to the relevant articles in the show notes, and we'll see you, we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks.